She was hung upside down by one ankle, a knife in her hand, and she was already telling him exactly what it would cost him to earn her. No white man had ever survived her people's trial. He said, "Cut me loose and try me," before she'd even finished the sentence, and the moment he said it, he knew he meant it. His name was Caleb Morrow, Colorado Territory, late autumn of 1882. A hill country rancher who'd lived 6 winters alone in these mountains, with nothing but cattle and cold mornings for company, and who had never once thought he was missing anything. Until the afternoon the world turned itself upside down and showed him otherwise. If you're watching this story about 2 stubborn people from different worlds who had to earn each other the hard way, hit like and subscribe right now so you never miss one of these. Stay till the end. The way this resolves her people's answer. His choice, you won't want to skip it. She was upside down in a hunter's snare, 10 feet off the ground, dark hair falling like a curtain toward the pine needles below, and she was already negotiating. Not begging, not screaming, negotiating. She told him in plain accented English that she would allow him to cut her down, but that if he thought this obligated her to anything, he was a fool. She told him there was one way, exactly one, that a man outside her people could earn a future beside her. He had to survive her band's trial. No white man had ever done it. He said, "Cut me loose and try me." Caleb Morrow was 34 years old and moved through the world like a man who'd made peace with solitude, which is different from actually being at peace with it. He had 260 acres on the eastern slope of the Wet Mountains, south of the Arkansas River, in a fold of land where the pines started thick and the elk came down in October like clockwork. He'd built the place himself, one wall at a time, in the year after the war fever took his wife and his small daughter in the same brutal month. He didn't talk about that. He'd learned not to. The few men he saw at the trading post in Rockvale had long since stopped asking. He ran 30 head of cattle on pasture he'd cleared by hand. He kept a garden that produced more than he could eat. In winter he trapped the creek bottoms for mink and marten, sold the pelts in Pueblo before spring, and came home with enough flour and coffee and tobacco to last another year. It was a clean life, a functioning life, and on most mornings he could look out at the canyon walls in the early light and think that it was enough. He was coming back from the North Ridge Line on an afternoon in late October when he heard it. Not a sound of distress, exactly. More like someone announcing their presence in a controlled way, a short, deliberate sound that was too measured to be panic. He reined the roan in and listened. Through the aspens, 60 yards off the trail, something was moving at an odd rhythm. Something was swinging. He tied his horse and went on foot. She was suspended by the right ankle from a branch 15 feet off the ground, caught in a steel-jawed leg trap on a length of rope, the kind of spring-set line a poacher would rig to catch a deer by a hind leg, which was illegal, which nobody enforced out here, and which had apparently caught something the poacher hadn't counted on. She had a knife in her right hand. She'd been working at the rope above her ankle and hadn't gotten through it yet, which told him the rope was fresh-braided rawhide, not old hemp. She wasn't struggling wildly. That's what struck him first. She was working methodically, sewing at a specific point in the rope while keeping her body still so she didn't spin. Her hair fell straight down. Her beaded buckskin dress, long fringe, geometric patterns along the hem in yellow and red and black, hung around her shoulders. She was looking at him before he'd made a sound. He stopped 10 feet away, she said, in English that was slower than his, but more careful. "I have been here since morning. If you intend to rob me, I have nothing. If you intend to harm me, I suggest you reconsider." She paused. "If you have a knife sharper than mine, I will allow you to cut the rope." He stood there for a moment. He said, "Lady, you've been hanging upside down too long. Blood's gone to your head." Something moved in her expression, not amusement exactly, but close to it. She held the rope steady and said, "My head is fine. The rope is the problem." He had a bowie knife on his belt. He looked at the branch, looked at the nearest tree, which was a young pine with branches low enough to climb. He said, "I'm going to climb up next to that branch and cut the rope from the top." "You'll want to brace for the drop," she said. "I know how falling works." He climbed the pine, worked his way out along the branch. It bent under his weight more than he liked, and cut through the rawhide rope in 6 strokes. She dropped, caught herself on her free foot for half a second, rolled her shoulder into the fall, and came up standing in the pine needles with the rope still coiled around her ankle and the trap dangling from it. She pulled the trap's jaws apart with both hands, worked her ankle free, tested her weight on it. It held. He climbed back down. She was looking at him the way you'd look at something you hadn't quite decided the nature of. Up close, she was perhaps 25, maybe younger. Her eyes were very dark and very direct. She had a huntress's hands calloused along the bowfinger, scarred at the heel of the right palm. She wore a medicine bag at her throat on a cord of twisted sinew. He said, "You speak English well." She said, "Yes." A pause. "My name is Nale. I am of the Jicarilla, from the band camped in the canyon north of your fence." He hadn't known there was a band in the North Canyon. He'd wondered about the smoke. He said, "Caleb Morrow. I run the ranch south of the ridge." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "You cut me down. I will not pretend that is nothing." Another pause. Longer. "But I will not be in debt to a man I don't know. So, I am going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." He said, "All right," she said. "My people have a trial, a proving. It was made for situations like this, when a man outside our band does something that matters, something real, and asks for something in return. If you complete the trial, my people will consider you worthy. If you are worthy," she stopped, looked at the trees, looked back. "I have refused 3 matches my uncle has arranged. I will not be traded or bargained. But a man who is worthy, that is a man I could choose to stand beside. Do you understand the difference?" He understood. The difference was everything. He should have said something measured. He should have said he didn't know her, that this was a strange conversation to be having in the middle of a pine forest in October with a woman who'd been hanging upside down 20 minutes ago. He should have said he'd think on it. He said, "Cut me loose and try me." She studied him. She said, "You haven't asked what the trial is." He said, "Tell me." She did. It wasn't one thing. It was a sequence, 5 tasks spread across 7 days, designed to test not strength alone, but judgment, patience, skill with a blade and a bow, knowledge of the land, and the ability to follow instruction from someone who knew more than you. The last task, she said, was at the discretion of her uncle, who was the band's headman, and who would decide what it was only after watching how he handled the first 4. She also told him, with no apology in her voice, that her uncle was unlikely to be pleased that she'd been found by a white rancher and that he would find reasons to doubt. That was just true. He should know it before he said yes. He said he already said yes. She looked at him once more. Then she turned and walked north through the pines and didn't look back. He stood in the trees until she disappeared, and then he rode home and tried to remember if he'd ever done anything that foolish before. He couldn't think of an instance. The Jicarilla camp in the North Canyon was more settled than Caleb had pictured. He'd half expected a temporary hunting camp, 6 lodges. What he found when Nali led him through the cedar breaks 3 days later was a winter encampment of 9 lodges, 24 horses, cooking fires and curing racks and children running between the trees. There were 2 elderly women working a hide near the central fire. 2 men sat mending gear by the creek. A 3rd man stood at the tree line with his arms crossed, watching Caleb arrive. His name was Chi. He was Nali's mother's brother, the headman, somewhere north of 50, with a face that had been weathering since before Caleb was born, and eyes that gave away nothing. He didn't offer a hand. He said to Nali in the Apache language something that made Nali's jaw tighten. She answered him shortly. He looked at Caleb. In English, he said, "She says you cut her down from a poacher's line." Caleb said, "That's right. She says you agreed to the proving without asking what it was." Caleb said, "She told me before I agreed. I just didn't ask her to stop and let me think about it first." Something shifted in Chi's face. Not warmth, but something, he said. "The proving starts tomorrow morning." Before dawn, he turned and walked away. Nali looked at Caleb. She said, "He was expecting you to negotiate." Caleb said, "There's nothing to negotiate." He sets the terms. I either do them or I don't. She looked at him with that same expression he'd seen in the pines. Not quite amusement, not quite something else. She said, "Come, I will show you where you sleep." The first day of the trial was tracking. Chi's nephew, a young man named Huero, who was about 20, and made it clear he found this entire arrangement absurd, led Caleb into the canyon before the sky lightened. He showed Caleb 3 sets of tracks in the creek mud, deer, a coyote, and a third animal Huero didn't identify, and told him to follow the third set for 2 miles and come back and say where it led. Caleb followed the tracks. They were old and partially washed, pressed into the silt at the edges of the creek where the bank flattened out. He lost them twice, found them again, lost them again at a rock shelf where the animal had crossed to dry ground. He spent 40 minutes circling the shelf until he found the scratch marks where it had come off the rock heading uphill. It was a black bear, a young one, and it had worked up the east slope to a berry thicket that was picked clean by now. And Caleb came back to the camp and said so. He described the specific scratch marks on the rock shelf and the way the tracks widened in the front feet on the uphill climb, which meant the animal was heavy for its size, probably well fed going into winter. Chi listened without expression. Huero's look of amused contempt had dropped by a notch. Nobody told him he'd done well. He hadn't expected them to. The second day was the bow. Nallie's cousin, a woman named Emma who was perhaps 30 and had the focused economy of motion of someone who'd been shooting since she was a child, handed Caleb a short recurve bow and set up a target on a pine 40 yards off. She made 3 shots herself, all tight to center, then handed the bow back and stepped aside. Caleb had used a long rifle all his life. He'd shot a bow exactly twice, both times at a county fair in Missouri when he was 12. He said that. Amma said, "I know. That isn't the point. He shot 12 arrows. 2 hit the outer ring. The rest hit the tree, the ground, or air." Amma watched with an unreadable face. When he'd emptied the quiver, she said, "Again," and handed him the bow. He shot 12 more. 3 hit the outer ring. 1 hit the inner. She said, "Your grip is wrong here." She adjusted his hand on the handle. He shot 6 more. 2 hit the inner ring. She said, "You don't give up when you're embarrassed." She gathered the arrows. That is worth something. He went back to the camp with pine sap on his hands and his shoulder aching from muscles he hadn't used before. Nolly was near the fire, grinding something in a stone bowl. She looked up when he sat down across from her. She said, "How was Amma?" He said, "She has good opinions about my grip." Nolly's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, she held up the bowl and said, "Do you know what this is?" He looked. Dark powder, finely ground with a sharp medicinal smell. He said, "I don't." She said, "Osha root. We call it bear medicine. It's for the chest, fever, cough, cold that won't break. We make it into a tea." She poured water from a clay pot into the bowl and stirred. "My mother taught me how to prepare this when I was 6. She paused. "My mother has been gone 4 winters. He sat with that for a moment. He said, "My wife and daughter, 6 winters." He looked at the fire. Same month, she looked at him. Not with pity. He would have closed down for pity. Something more like recognition. The look of a person who knows the specific weight of a particular kind of grief and sees it on someone else. She said, "Fever?" He said, "Yes." She said nothing for a while. She stirred the Osha tea. She handed it to him not because he was sick, he thought, but because it was a thing she could do, and she wanted to do it. He drank it. It tasted like pine and earth and something else he couldn't name. He handed back the bowl. The fire crackled. Above the pines the stars were thick. She said, "The silence doesn't hurt you, does it? Most people can't sit in silence this long." He said, "I've had a lot of practice." She said, "So have I." The third day was the hardest. Chi let him out himself before dawn without telling him where they were going. They walked 2 hours into the high country, above the tree line, onto a bare ridge where the wind came off the peaks with teeth. Chi pointed to a rock outcrop 300 yards away and said, "There is a man camped there. He has been there since yesterday. He is watching this camp." Caleb looked. He couldn't see anything. Chi said, I want to know who he is. I want you to find out without being seen, without confronting him, and without approaching within 50 yards. Caleb said, You want me to observe him. Chi said, I want you to tell me what I need to know to decide what to do about him. He paused. And I want you to understand why I am not doing this myself. It wasn't a question, but Caleb thought about it. He said, Because if he's a lookout for someone, and the head man of the band goes to observe him personally, it tells whoever sent him that the band is alerted. Chi looked at him. He said, Yes. He sat down on a rock and pulled out a pipe. Come back at midday. Caleb worked down the back slope, swung wide around the canyon below, came up through a fold in the ridge that put the wind behind him, or rather, put him crosswise to the wind, so the smell carried neither toward him nor toward the outcrop. It took 2 hours of careful movement, belly crawling the last 100 yards through scrub juniper, before he could see the man clearly. White, middle-aged, a canvas duster, a Winchester propped against the rock beside him, a pair of field glasses around his neck. He was eating from a tin and making marks on a paper in his lap. Behind him, picketed to a cedar, was a horse with a brand Caleb recognized, the Double T out of Canyon City, which meant Tabor, Cole Tabor, who'd been trying to buy grazing land in this canyon for 2 years, and who'd been refused by the county land office 3 times because the land was occupied. Occupied by the Jicarilla band Caleb was currently undergoing a trial for. He lay in the juniper for another 20 minutes and memorized everything he could see before he worked his way back. He told Chi. All of it, the brand, the field glasses, the paper, the specific look of a man making notes rather than hunting. He said Tabor's name. He said Tabor had tried and failed 3 times to acquire the canyon by legal means. Chi sat with his pipe for a long time. He said, You know this man. Caleb said, I know of him. He bought out 2 ranchers north of Rockvale 3 years ago by undercutting their water rights, made it so they couldn't operate. Chi said, And you believe he is here because of us? Caleb said, I believe he's here because this land is worth something, and he hasn't given up on getting it. Chi knocked the ash from his pipe. He stood. He looked at Caleb with that giving-away-nothing face that was starting to feel not readable exactly, but familiar. He said, The 4th task is tomorrow. He walked back toward camp. Caleb stood on the ridge in the October wind and thought about Cole Tabor making notes in the high country, and what notes like that usually led to, and felt something settle in him. A cold, solid kind of clarity. Whatever the 4th task was, he was going to do it. And then, if Chi's 5th task was reasonable, he was going to do that too. And then he was going to figure out what to do about Cole Tabor. One thing at a time. The 4th task was medicine. Nolly's youngest cousin, a girl of 9 named Lucha, had a chest infection that had been worsening for 4 days. Alma had managed it with Osha and yarrow tea. But the girl was running a fever now and breathing short. Nolly told Caleb, with a directness he'd come to appreciate, that the task was not to cure the child. She wasn't sure any man or woman could cure the child quickly, but to sit with her through the night and do exactly what Nolly told him to do. Nothing more, nothing less, and to not leave when it got hard. He said he understood. What followed was the longest night he'd spent since his daughter died. Nolly worked by firelight, careful and unhurried, with the knowledge of someone who'd been doing this since she was a girl. She made a steam poultice of pine resin and Osha, and had Caleb hold the bowl close to the child's face, so she breathed the vapor. She showed him how to feel for the tightness in the child's chest by pressing 2 fingers below the collarbone, not pressing hard, just enough to feel the resistance. She had him change the cool cloth on the girl's forehead every quarter hour. She showed him how to prop the child at an angle, so the drainage in her lungs shifted. Around midnight, Lucha woke and looked at Caleb with the glassy-eyed suspicion of a sick child confronted with a stranger. Nally said something quiet to her in Jicarilla. The girl looked at him for a long moment, and then closed her eyes again. Nally said, without looking up from what she was doing, I told her you were being tested. She said she hoped you were passing. He said, What do you think? She was quiet for a moment. She said, I think you hold things the way they need to be held. She changed the poultice. My mother used to say that was what you looked for in a person, not what they did when it was easy. He said, Your mother sounds like she was worth listening to. She said, She was. A pause. He said, Good opinions or bad? She said, Complicated ones. She had complicated opinions about most things worth having opinions about. The girl's fever broke around 3 a.m. By dawn she was sleeping easy, and Nolly was sitting back against the lodge wall with the look of someone who'd fought a long fight and came out on top. She had oil from the pine resin on her hands and a smear of ash on one cheekbone. She looked, at that moment, like the most capable person Caleb had ever shared a room with. He said, Will she be all right? Nolly said, Yes, she just needed someone to stay. She looked at him. So did you. 6 winters is a long time to stay alone. He didn't answer that, but he felt the truth of it, which was worse than any answer he could have given. The 5th day was waiting. She came to him in the morning and said, The last task is not ready. I will tell you when it is. He walked away. Caleb waited. He helped 2 of the younger men repair a stretch of horsepin fence that had rotted. He split wood for the communal stack. He sat with Amma in the afternoon while she fletched arrows, and she corrected his grip again, unsolicited, and then handed him her bow without a word, and let him practice on a pine trunk 20 feet away until the afternoon light went flat. He hit it 9 times out of 12. She said, Better. He didn't think she gave out better very often. In the evening, Nolly found him at the fire. She had her medicine bag in her lap, and she was sorting through its contents, small wrapped bundles. A carved bone awl, a folded square of cloth with something dried between its layers. She worked without speaking for a while. He watched the fire. She said, My uncle is deciding. About you, he said. I know. She said he saw everything, the tracking, the bow, the ridge. He was watching last night, too. He watches everything. That's why he's been headman for 20 years. She paused. He hasn't decided yet, but he is deciding. That's different from before, he said. What was before? She said before he had decided already, when you walked into camp. She tied a bundle with a strip of sinew. You weren't supposed to be possible. You understand. In his experience, men who do what you did, who cut a woman down and don't immediately want something from it, they're rare. And men outside are people who agree to approving without arguing about the terms. That's the kind of thing he's heard about but never seen. Caleb said, I haven't finished yet. She said, No, but the kind of person who finishes is already visible in the person who starts. He looked at her in the firelight. The way she talked, careful, exact, nothing wasted, reminded him of the way she'd worked through the long night with Lucha. Like every word was a choice. He said, What happens if Chi says no? She said, Then you go home. She met his eyes, and I don't. He said, And if he says yes? She said, Then I get to make a choice. She looked back at the fire. That's what the trial is for. Not to satisfy my uncle. To give me the information I need to make a real choice. I've been watching you for 5 days, same as he has. She paused. Probably more carefully, he said. And, she said, I'm still watching. It was the right answer, and they both knew it. He went to sleep in the lodge Chi had given him, feeling something he hadn't felt in 6 winters. Not happiness exactly, more like the specific awareness that you are in the right place, doing the right thing, and that what happens next is going to matter. The 5th task came on the 6th morning, and it came from outside. 2 of Chi's outriders came back at a hard gallop before breakfast. Caleb was at the creek when they rode in. He couldn't hear the words, but he could read Chi's face as the report came in. The specific tightening around the eyes that meant the information was bad, and the shape of it was not a surprise. He found Nolly. He said, Tabor. She said, Men came in the night. 3 riders. They cut the fence line on the south meadow and pushed the horse herd toward the canyon mouth. 6 horses are gone. She paused. My uncle believes it is a provocation. If we go to recover the horses, it could be a trap. If we don't, they'll come back for more. He thought about it for less time than it might have taken another man, he said. Which direction did the outriders lose the trail? She said, South, down the canyon toward the creek ford. He said, That's Tabor's direction of travel. If he took horses, he didn't take them north to sell. That road goes through country where everyone knows the Jicarilla Band. He took them south toward Canyon City, where he can run them through a trading post he controls, and they disappear. He paused. I know where that ford is. I know the ground between here and there. He looked at her. I need to talk to your uncle. Chi listened with his arms crossed. When Caleb finished talking, he said, You are saying you want to go alone. Caleb said, I'm saying I should go first and alone. I know the terrain better than your riders do in that stretch. I also know what Tabor looks like, what his brand looks like, and how he operates. He paused. If I can get to the ford before they reach it, and document that he has your animals, that's a legal matter. The county sheriff in Rockvale is not a good man, but he is not a Tabor man. Evidence he can't ignore is different from a complaint he can dismiss. Chi said, And if they don't stop at the ford? Caleb said, Then I follow until they stop, and I send word back. Chi looked at him, looked at Nali. He said something in Jicarilla that Caleb didn't catch. Nali answered him at some length. Caleb waited. Chi looked back at Caleb. He said, Huero goes with you. Caleb said, Understood. He and Huero took the south trail at a canter. The younger man rode well. Better than Caleb, but he kept pace without showing off. An hour into the ride, when they dropped below the cedar line, Huero said in a voice that suggested the effort cost him something, You held Lucha last night when she was bad. I saw. Caleb said, Nali told me what to do. Huero said, Yes, but you stayed. A pause. My father wouldn't have stayed. He was Jicarilla his whole life, and he wouldn't have stayed. It was the most personal thing the young man had said to him in 6 days. Caleb didn't have a response that felt right, so he just said, I'm sorry about your father. Huero nodded. They rode on. They caught Tabor's party at the creek ford, exactly where Caleb had calculated. 4 men, 6 horses on a lead line, and one of the horses, a gray mare with a distinctive white sock on the left hind, was a horse Caleb had seen in the Jicarilla herd 2 days ago when he was mending fence. He and Huero came down the creek bank at a walk, not a run. Coming in hard would trigger guns. Coming in slow and visible meant they were calculating. Tabor saw them. He reined up. His 3 men spread out slightly, not reaching for weapons yet, just spacing themselves. The language of men who weren't sure yet how this was going to go. Caleb stopped 20 yards off. He said, Mr. Tabor, Caleb Morrow, out of the wet mountains. Tabor said, Morrow. His voice was neutral, measuring. You're a long way from your place. Caleb said, I've been doing some work in the North Canyon. He looked at the horses. He let his eyes rest on the gray mare for a moment, then come back to Tabor's face. He said, Those your horses? Tabor said, Picked up strays, open range. Caleb said, That gray mare is wearing a rope mark on her right cannon bone where a hobble was. Fresh mark. Someone had her picketed recently. He kept his voice conversational. I also recognize her. Saw her 2 days ago at the Jicarilla winter camp in the North Canyon. The camp of a band that's been in that canyon by treaty rights since before either of us was running cattle in this county. Tabor said nothing. His jaw was working. Caleb said, I'm going to write down what I'm looking at right now, and Huero here is going to ride back to camp for witnesses, and I'm going to wait here with you until they arrive. Or, he let that sit. You turn the horses loose right now and ride down that I saw 6 horses at the creek ford, and they were in your custody, and you released them. And that is where it stops. Tabor looked at him, looked at Huero, looked at his 3 men who were looking at each other. He said, You're sitting real comfortable for 1 man with 1 rifle. Caleb said, I have a rifle, a documented connection to the band those horses came from. And your name in a letter I gave my neighbor before I left this morning, with instructions to deliver it to the county sheriff in Rockvale if I wasn't back by dark. My neighbor is a punctual man. That last part wasn't true, but it was the right thing to say. Tabor studied him for a long moment. Something went out of his face. The cold, calculating look that was his natural expression became something flatter. He reached over and undid the lead line on the horses. They milled for a moment at the water's edge. He said, You've made an enemy, Morrow. Caleb said, I had a few already. He didn't move until Tabor's party had crossed the ford and ridden south. Then he sat quietly for a moment, listening to the creek. Huero pulled up beside him. He said, "There was no letter." Caleb said, "No." Huero said nothing for a beat. Then he said, "Next time there should be." Caleb said, "Agreed." They brought the horses back to the canyon as the afternoon light went low and gold through the pines. The camp heard them coming before they arrived. The sound of 6 horses on the trail is its own announcement. And Chi was at the tree line when they rode in, with Amma beside him and Nali a step behind. Caleb got down from his horse and gave the leave line to Huero. He walked to where Chi was standing. He said, "Your horses, and Tabor will have trouble explaining to anyone in the county what he was doing with them if he tries to push again. I can write a formal record of what I saw today and file it with the county land office. It won't stop him forever, but it will make the next move harder." Chi looked at him. The firelight was behind him now, the pines going dark at their edges. He said, "Why?" It wasn't a question about today. Caleb knew that. It was the larger question. Why any of this? Why a white rancher from the south side of the ridge was standing in a Jicarilla winter camp on the 6th day of approving? Having ridden south to face down a land grabber he had no personal quarrel with. He said, "Because what's happening to your band is wrong, and because I've been watching Tabor work the county for 2 years, and I didn't want to be on the wrong side of it." He paused. He looked past Chi to where Nali was standing, and he was not going to pretend that was the only reason, because he had too much respect for Chi and for her and for all of them to pretend. He said, "And because I want to be here, if that's allowed." Chi was quiet for a long moment. The fire behind him snapped. Somewhere in the camp, Lucha was calling for her mother in a voice that was stronger than it had been 4 days ago. Chi said, "The trial was 5 tasks. You'd have done 5. He turned and walked toward the fire. That was all. That was everything. Nali came to him at the edge of the trees where he was standing with his horse's reins in his hands, not quite sure what came next. She stopped an arm's length away. She said, "He is not a man who says, 'Well done.' You understand that?" Caleb said, "I understood it by day 2. She said, "He has decided you are worthy." She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes. "That is his decision. Now I need to tell you mine," he said. "I'm listening," she said. "I watched you for 6 days. I watched how you moved through the tracking and didn't bluff when you lost the trail. I watched how you shot badly and kept shooting until you shot better. I watched how you lay in the juniper for 2 hours and came back with the information my uncle needed, instead of the information that would have made you look brave. I watched you through the night with Lucha." She paused. "I watched you today." He waited. She said, "My mother used to say that a man shows you who he is when things are hard, and no one is watching who can reward him for it." She paused. "You have been watched all week, but I don't think you knew it because you behaved the same way regardless." He said quietly, "I knew you were watching." She said, "I know you did." The corner of her mouth moved. "That was the last piece of information I needed." They stood at the tree line in the October dark. The pines were breathing in the cold that was coming down off the peaks. From the camp came the low voice of someone singing, one of the older women, a low constant sound that had been the background of the past 6 evenings. He'd started listening for it. He said, "I should go back to my place tonight, deal with my cattle. Come back." He paused. "If that's all right," she said. "Yes, come back." A pause. "Bring your neighbor, the one who was supposed to send the letter." He said, "That man doesn't exist." She said, "I know." She looked at him steadily. "Bring someone anyway, so that next time the letter is real." He said, "I have several." He rode back south that night with the moon rising behind the peaks and the aspens all bare now, their white trunks pale in the moonlight, and the smell of snow somewhere above the timberline that meant winter was close. He felt lighter than he had in years, and heavier at the same time. In the good way, the way you feel when something has weight because it matters. He had things to deal with. The formal record he'd promised, which he would write in the morning and ride to Pueblo to file. A conversation with his actual neighbor, a widower named Olds who had cattle on the next ridge over, and who would, Caleb suspected, be willing to be told about the situation in the North Canyon, and asked to keep an eye on it. The question of Cole Tabor, who was not done and would not be done until he was made to be, which was going to take more than one strategic lie at a creek ford. And the larger question, which wasn't a question exactly but a fact that was going to require some navigation, the woman in the North Canyon had decided he was worthy of a choice, and she had made the choice. And he had said he wanted to be there, and now those two things were in the world together. He didn't mind that it was complicated. He'd noticed over the past 6 days that complicated things, dealt with honestly and without cutting corners, tended to work out in ways that simpler things didn't. He came back 3 days later. He brought Olds, who was 57 years old and generally disapproving of everything except good cattle and simple honesty, and who walked into the Jicarilla camp with his hat in his hands and said to Chi in a voice that didn't perform anything, "I hear you've been having trouble with Tabor." "I had trouble with Tabor once. I'd be glad to be one more set of eyes on the situation if that's useful." Chi looked at him for a long moment and said, "Sit down." And that was that. Caleb spent the winter going back and forth between his ranch and the canyon, not abandoning one for the other, learning how to hold both. Nolly taught him the Jicarilla names for the plants in the canyon, the ones that healed and the ones that didn't, the ones that were good for horses and the ones that would founder them. She taught him how to read clouds off the San de Cristo peaks for weather, which was more reliable than anything he'd learned farming in Missouri. He showed her how he read the creek water levels for spring snowmelt, and how he built his root cellar to keep vegetables through 6 months of cold. She said the angle he'd chosen for the cellar wall was wrong and explained why, and she was right. She was frequently right. He stopped being surprised by this somewhere around the 3rd week. In December, Tabor made another move. Not horses this time. A written claim filed with the county land office asserting that the North Canyon was unoccupied federal land. Caleb caught wind of it through Olds, who had a sister in Pueblo who worked for a title company. They went to Pueblo together, Caleb and Olds and Chi's nephew, who turned out to speak better English than he'd ever let on in Caleb's presence. And they sat in front of a land office clerk named Birch, who didn't want to be there but who couldn't argue with a survey record, and 2 corroborating witnesses, and a formal letter from a 3rd witness, who was a retired Army surveyor, living in Denver, and who'd mapped the canyon's treaty boundaries in 1872. The claim was denied. Tabor showed up at the land office while they were still there. He looked at Caleb for a long moment and didn't say anything. Caleb looked back. After a while, Tabor turned and left. Caleb did not think this was over, but he thought the shape of the problem had changed. On the ride back from Pueblo, Chi's nephew, his name was Elon, and he had an opinion about everything and had apparently been keeping it to himself all autumn, as a form of evaluation, said to Caleb, "My uncle wants to know if you are planning to be practical about this situation, or romantic." Caleb said, "What did he mean by that?" Elon said, "I think he means, are you going to do the right things or the comfortable ones?" Caleb said, "Good, because Nolly doesn't do comfortable." He paused. "She does right things, she just does them her way." Caleb said, "I noticed." January brought the deep cold and 2 feet of snow on the high country, and Caleb spent 3 consecutive weeks in the canyon when his cattle were settled and the passes closed, helping with firewood and water hauling and the 1,000 small necessities of a camp in hard winter. He mended gear. He helped a young man named Cato set and check a trap line in the valley floor. He sat up again with Lucha when she had a minor fever that didn't amount to much but scared her mother, and this time he knew what to do without being shown. One evening in late January, after the rest of the camp was asleep, Nally came and sat beside him at the fire with 2 cups of Osha tea. She handed him one. They sat for a while in the way they'd learned to sit, not because there was nothing to say, but because sometimes the best use of a comfortable silence is to let it be one. She said, "You keep coming back." He said, "I keep meaning to stop. Somehow I always have a reason to come back," she said. "I think you are making up the reasons," he said. "Probably." She looked at her tea. She said, "Caleb, I want you to understand something." She looked at him. "When I set the trial, I was not looking for a husband. I was looking for a person, the kind of person who, if I chose to bind my future to them, would not make me less than I am. I have been watching you all winter for that. Not just during the proving." She paused. "I think I have seen it. I wanted to tell you, because it's true, and because I don't hold truth back when I have it." He said, "What does it mean for you to bind your future to someone?" She said, "It means what you think it means. It means we build something together." She paused. "Your people have a word for it," he said. "So do yours." She said, "Yes." She looked at the fire. "In Jicarilla the ceremony is in spring, when the ground thaws. My uncle performs it." She paused. "If that is what I decide," he said, "is it what you decide?" She was quiet for a long moment. The fire was low, warm, steady. She said, "Yes." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, just her hand, both of them looking at the fire, the cold air close above them and the pines standing all around, and the camp quiet. She let him hold it. The silence between them was the most comfortable thing he'd sat in since he could remember. In March, when the snow was pulling back from the lower slopes and the creek was running strong with melt, Chi came to Caleb at the fire one morning and sat down beside him with no preamble. He said, "My wife's cousin will bring the food. Amma will handle the fire. Ellen will handle the horses. You will handle your side of the arrangements. Nally tells me you have been to a church ceremony before." Caleb said, "Once." Chi said, "This is not like that." He paused. "It is better." He stood and walked away, which Caleb had come to understand meant the conversation was complete and correct, and didn't need anything added to it. He went to find Nolly. She was at the east edge of camp, at the tree line where she sometimes went in the mornings to watch the light change on the canyon walls. He came and stood beside her, and she said without turning, "My uncle told you." He said, "He did." She said, "He has accepted you." He said, "He also said the ceremony is better than a church." She said, "He's right." She turned to look at him. The light was coming over the canyon rim now, that first good light of a March morning, when everything looks clean and new and like it might turn into something. "Are you frightened?" He said, "Yes, of getting it wrong." "Not of it," she said. "That is exactly the right thing to be frightened of." She turned back to the canyon wall, and he stood beside her, and they watched the light come in. Below them, the camp was waking up. Luch's voice carried from somewhere near the central fire, high and clear and alive. Above them, the sky was the particular color of early March in the mountains, a blue that felt like it had been waiting all winter to come back. He thought about 6 winters alone on the south ridge, the quiet and the cold, and the way he'd learned to fill the space where a family had been with work and solitude, and the idea that it was enough. He thought about a woman hanging upside down in the trees, already negotiating, already more herself in that position than most people managed in a lifetime of comfort. He thought about the trial, the tracking, the bow, the ridge, the long night with the sick child, the creek ford. None of those things had been easy, and none of them had been what he expected, and he had not once at any point considered stopping. Some things you start and you find out who you are by finishing them. Some tests are designed for that. Some of the best ones don't look like tests at all. He had been alone for 6 winters, and he did not intend to be alone for the next 6. The spring ceremony took place on a clear morning in early April, when the aspens were just beginning to show their first small leaves, and the meadow below the camp had its first grass. Chi performed it. Olds came and stood at the edge of the gathering with his hat in his hands. Amma built the fire. Ellen handled the horses and looked simultaneously proud and exasperated, which seemed to be his natural state. Nally wore her best buckskin, the one with the geometric patterns along the hem in yellow and red and black. She had her hair unbraided for the ceremony, falling long and straight, and around her throat the medicine bag her mother had given her. She looked like a woman who had made a choice, and was standing squarely in the middle of it. Caleb stood beside her and thought that he had gone out to check his north fence line on an ordinary October afternoon, and come back a completely different man, and that the only regret he had about that was that it had taken him 6 winters to wander far enough from his own grief to be in the right place at the right time. He wasn't going to say that out loud. He didn't need to. She looked at him with those direct dark eyes, and he thought she could probably see most of what he was thinking, and he found he didn't mind that at all. Chi spoke. Caleb didn't understand the words, but he understood the weight of them. Then Nali translated quietly in that careful English of hers, not every word, just the heart of it, that two people were choosing each other with clear eyes, that the band was witness, that the choice was binding and real, and made by two people who knew what they were doing. He said, when it was his turn to speak, I came here to pass a test. I found out the test was a way of learning something I needed to know. I know it now. I'm not going anywhere, she said, in the quiet that followed, in her own language, and then in his. I set the trial because I needed to know the shape of your character before I trusted you with anything. I know the shape now. It is a good shape. It was, he thought, probably the most accurate marriage vow he'd ever heard. Chi said something final. The gathering was quiet. Above them, in the canyon, a red-tailed hawk was circling on the thermals, lazy and precise and unbothered. Nali took his hand. He held it. That was how it started. The man who cut a woman down from a snare and said, try me, and the woman who set a trial for him because she needed to know the truth and saw no reason to want less. They weren't the same afterward. You can't spend 6 days trying to prove yourself to a community that has every reason to doubt you, and a winter learning what another person's knowledge and courage looks like up close, and come out the same person you were. He was better. She was more certain they had both been alone for too long, and now they were not. The cabin on the south ridge was added on to that summer. Nali brought her medicine knowledge and her mother's grinding stone and 3 years' worth of careful notes about which plants grew where in the canyon. He brought his tools and his root cellar and 30 head of cattle and the hard-won knowledge that solitude, while often necessary, is not the same thing as strength. They lived in both places according to the season, which is to say they built their life the way Nali said everything worth building was built, by paying attention to what the situation actually required, not to what you'd originally planned. That's what worthy meant, in the end, not the man who was strongest or bravest, or the best shot. The man who would look at a situation clearly and do what it required, even when it required more than he'd expected, even when no one who could reward him was watching. She'd known it when she saw it. She'd seen it from 10 feet off the ground, upside down in the pines, while the blood ran to her head, and her knife wasn't quite sharp enough to cut the rope. She'd set a trial to be sure. She'd been right about being right. Some people are.